All right, well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for allowing us to push this class back an hour. I know you have a bed to get to, but we are lucky because we have actually flown in one of our academic advisors for this evening's class, Erica Chenoweth. And I mentioned this last week. A couple of our presenters have actually referenced her work. It's constantly referenced by those of us who study and work in this field, which is the database of nonviolent and violent conflict campaigns and the successes or failures of those. So tonight we have her for the full 2 hours to really explain what this research was all about, how she conducted it, and what it means for the field at large. But before we hand it over to Erica, Jack Duvall is back. He knows that the class is coming to an end, and he wanted to make sure he was able to come back and see you all again before our final dinner, banquet, whatever you want to call it, which is next Thursday, and I'll talk more about that at the end of class. But Jack, why don't you start?
Thank you, Darren. Next week I would be here on the final night, but several months ago, particularly since my colleague Peter Ackerman is going to be unable to make it. So it will be a fresh and different cast of characters for your class next week. But because I can't make it, I have a speaking engagement I agreed to several months ago before we even knew the dates of this course. I wanted to come and make good on my promise that I would be back, first and foremost. If any of you here who have soldiered on through this course and clearly are enjoying it, because no one puts up with a voluntary course for this number of weeks unless you really actually dug the content. I just want to thank you on behalf of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. A great deal of cumulative thought and preparation and considerable planning goes into the content of the courses that we do with whomever we do them, particularly the U.S. Institute of Peace. And this course is by no means a boilerplate exercise. No course, no workshop, no institute, no seminar we do is that. We always reconsider the substance that we want to provide on the basis of what we're learning about how people are learning about civil resistance. So we tune up and we re-platform every piece of content we put into the educational experiences that we offer to people. And that is in no small part a function of what we learn from people who are participating. And rest assured, Darren and Macho and everyone else associated with ICNC have learned a great deal from each one of you based on your feedback and reactions and thoughts and experiences. If there's anything that you would like to ask me, or observations or comments you'd like to give to me directly, just email me. I'd be happy to respond to you personally, one or two have during the course of the almost a semester. It's hard, it's such an academic term. But it's really a delight for us to have Erica Chenoweth here with you today. She is one of the leading younger lights of the, and she's younger only in relation to all of the ancient timber in this field that is still standing and is part of the enlarging network of academic advisors and collaborators that we work with at ICNC and with whom and whose work we benefited from. But hers is among the most important work, regardless of age, background, and hers is Sterling, or predilections or interests, because it's based on hard social science. Many times we've been at a booth in the last couple of years, and a social scientist of some sort, usually a political scientist, has come up to the table and has surveyed our material, seen our books, and sort of cocked a skeptical eyebrow, and nonviolent, oh, well, I don't really have to be concerned about that. And then but someone snags them with a comment where they see a stack of the articles on the desk that were authored by Erica and by Maria Stefan, Why Civil Resistance Works. They start flipping through and they start seeing data and they start seeing huge numbers of long footnotes, and right away they begin drawing in. The size of the footnote is just, it's like it has a narcotic effect, these social scientists, and so they're hooked, and they say there may be something to this that I didn't imagine, 4 or 5 years ago, when this is not singing Kumbaya, around a campfire necessarily. These are events that happen in real life, and someone has approached these events more rigorously than others have before, and that's certainly what Erica has done with her project at Wesleyan, about which I'm sure she will tell you, apart from the substance of her presentation. She's been a pleasure to work with. We are proud of her membership on our Committee of Academic Advisors, and I know you will enjoy what she has to say.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Jack and Darren and everybody at ICNC for inviting me here. I was told that you're an engaged crowd, that you like to participate. So I modified my typical pitch a little bit tonight, and what I'm going to do is hopefully just have a conversation with you. The research that I'm going to talk about tonight is funded by ICNC and is culminated in that 2008 article that hopefully you had a chance to look over for tonight. And if you didn't, no big deal. You'll get the thrust anyway. And also in a book that's being published and will be released this spring by Columbia University Press by the same title. And additional research, which I'll be talking to you about tonight, is underway at Wesleyan, and it's being funded also by ICNC and Wesleyan. So I look forward to just talking to you about the state of the field in a way. And I can actually say that, that at least in my field, I'll first just, in the interest of full disclosure, tell you that I didn't come to this question from civil resistance, nonviolent conflict, peace studies background at all. In fact, I accidentally stumbled upon a pedagogical workshop that ICNC was supporting in Colorado in June of 2006 at Colorado College, and it was called People, Power, and Pedagogy. And one of my terrorism colleagues, because I was writing my dissertation on terrorism at the time, he emailed me and said, here's the other side of the coin. And I actually applied to go because I was a graduate student, and anything where you can have some exposure and hear what people are doing is a good opportunity. So I applied, and I got a package in the mail of a bunch of books and articles from ICNC saying, read these before you show up. And I could not believe that I had never heard of any of them before. The reason is because of my own ignorance and the silo I was in on academic research on political violence. And what was really striking to me is how similar so many of the dynamics were of what Jack and Peter's book was about, and all of the other articles that were coming out in Kurt Schock's book. So many of these dynamics were similar to the stuff that I studied in political violence, but there wasn't any cross-referencing going on in my field. I found that really interesting. I went to the workshop and I learned a ton there, and I sort of this notion was reinforced that it seems odd that we're talking about fundamentally the same power processes, but in my world it's guns, bombs, or nothing's happening. It's always there's violence or there's nothing in terms of people's mobilization. And I thought, well, at the time, the really in vogue thing to do was to look at how effective different types of violence were. So Robert Pape had this famous article out on the strategic logic of suicide terrorism, and he was saying that suicide bombing happened because it worked. And one of the key critiques of that was that he didn't compare it against any of the other alternative strategies that you could possibly use besides suicide bombing. So he gave a figure of what percentage of the time it worked, but didn't compare it against what percentage of the time, say, nonviolent action could have worked to get what these different groups were asking for. I sort of asked permission to do this study and asked for some support, and was able to start to collect aggregate data on campaigns of nonviolent direct action. And fortunately, because of the huge amounts of literature that have been built up on this subject by scholars for decades, there was a lot to work with in terms of finding this data. And so there were all kinds of different writings that were really rich in detail, qualitative works that talked about the dynamics of these conflicts, what was going on during them, how they were leveraging different points of power, what the key theoretical expectations were about what would make these movements work and what wouldn't. And basically Maria and I set about trying to draw up an explanation for what specifically makes nonviolent campaigns successful if we compare them to violent campaigns. And so we found this one particular point of leverage which we thought was pretty compelling, and it was security force defections. And so that became the hypothesis that we looked for when we collected this data. Collected data on basically the campaigns from 1900 to 2006, what happened in the course of the campaign with regard to security force defections, and external support and membership in the campaign and this sort of thing. And ultimately, in this article that you read for today, we report the finding that security force defections really are the things that make the difference. The book that we have coming out modifies that argument a little bit. And the reason is because it was pretty clear that not all nonviolent campaigns succeed in producing these security force defections. You have to have something else in order to even get to that point. And so the fundamental argument we make in the book is that nonviolent campaigns are better at producing the mass participation that then produces the security force defections. So that's just like the broad intellectual overview of how we got to where we are, but I actually wanted to make this talk more about how we study nonviolent conflict and then give you some kind of information about where the field is now. So I want to start with a question for you, which will hopefully illuminate some of the challenges that a person confronts when they want to study this topic. And the question is, first of all, how many of you are familiar with the 1977 to 79 Iranian Revolution? You've heard of it before. Is everybody familiar? Okay. Here's the question. Was that a nonviolent revolution or a violent revolution? Yeah.
I know most people say it was nonviolent, but I think it was a little bit mixed.
Okay.
I think it started non-violent revolution, then ended with the bloody execution.
Okay. So did the bloody part happen before or after the actual revolution was over?
Oh,
Yeah.
right before and after.
Okay.
No, but also there's some bloody actions done by the government
Right.
toward the people.
Okay.
From my reading, I thought it was the other way around. It started as a bloody movement and then turned into a non-violent movement, if you will.
Right. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, so we have multiple different configurations, and this should shed some light on the challenges that one faces, because there are different accounts of this sort of a thing. Many of them are looking for a particular type of action, and so they over-report that action. So if it's to your political benefit to say it was violent, you might look for the key violent activities and then cast the whole thing as violent, right? On the other hand, if you are interested in calling it nonviolent for any one of your normative reasons, then you might just focus on the nonviolent aspects and say something like the revolution was hijacked, by violent people in the end. In our data set, it's a nonviolent revolution that was actually hijacked toward the end by people that exploited it. But you may or may not know that the Iranian Revolution was the most broad-based revolution we've ever seen. There were estimates of 10% of the population that was involved in this. One of the other most popular revolutions we've ever seen was the French Revolution, and that had 2%. So this is a hugely participatory revolution. Yeah?
Wasn't a very high percentage of the population involved in the Cedars Revolution in Lebanon?
Yes.
Where they had like more than 1 million people on the streets out of a total population of maybe, I don't know exactly, 4 million?
Yeah, that's right. I'm not exactly sure how many people are in Lebanon, but there were at least 1 million people in the Cedar Revolution. So it's definitely one of the most participatory as well. But heretofore, the Iranian Revolution up through the 70s was like a really important revolution in terms of the number of people participating. And in fact, the vast majority, we're talking 90-some% of the events that occurred from the side of the civilians who were prosecuting the conflict were nonviolent. The state was certainly repressive and violent toward the civilian protesters. And of course, the aftermath of it, after there was sort of a nonviolent coup, was that elements of the new state started to crack down violently on people. And so, but this just demonstrates the complexity of trying to get at some of these issues. The idea is that there's considerable misinformation about the nature of different campaigns that really makes it difficult to make a judgment about whether they're nonviolent or violent. But it's really important to make a judgment, because measurement is all about judgments. It's all about cutting off in different categories so that you can actually compare things as apples and apples rather than apples and oranges, as it were. And one of the things that I'm most interested in is looking at the conventional wisdoms and how we can use categories of analysis in order to confront some of these conventional wisdoms. The ones that I'm the most interested in are these. The first is that insurgents, that is violent insurgents, use violence because it's effective and because it's a last resort. So they've exhausted all other means of potentially getting what they want, and so they are driven to use violence. It's a very common notion. The other one is that they use violence because it works, right? So not only is it a last resort, but it's the only thing that will get them what they want. There's also, I think, a number of conventional wisdoms about nonviolent resistance, the first of which is that it doesn't work against really repressive regimes. So it only works against those that are really vulnerable to being undermined in the first place. The second is that if you're asking for really tough demands, like something like national liberation or regime change, nonviolent resistance won't work. And so you often hear people say that nonviolent resistance works better if you're just after a civil rights issue or labor rights, something like that. The third one, which is a very kind of political science-y thing, is that nonviolent campaigns only emerge in contexts where they're likely to succeed in the first place, and that's what explains their high level of success.
Yeah, I'm curious about the article where it said Max Abrams said that the terrorists only accomplish their objective 7% of the time, but still actors choose it because it's more effective than nonviolent resistance.
Yeah.
I mean, how is that possible?
Well, that's what he's arguing, and that actually is a claim that we take on in our article by saying, well, so terrorists succeed 7% of the time, and then he says they use it because it's more. This is what he says in his article. They use it because it's more effective than nonviolent. Must be more effective than other alternatives. And we say, no, actually, it's not more effective than other alternatives. And so, we're challenging that. Yeah.
If I may also just add something to that, I think no one chooses one strategy over another because it is more effective. They choose it because they perceive it as being more effective. And then you have to ask the question, why is violence, terrorism being perceived as more effective, even though it probably is not?
Yeah.
And then we're into the discussions about media, about worldviews, reality tunnels, many of these different things.
Yeah.
I think the perception here is key.
I think so too. You just jumped the gun and stole my last point. It's totally good. So I think you're right. All of this research approaches this from a rational actor perspective, assuming that if everybody has the same information, they'll make the right choice in terms of their maximization potential. And what we find is that these choices are available and they're quickly discarded by some people in favor of violence. And so the question is, what is it that's driving? It's not efficacy. And it may not even be the perception of efficacy. It may be that they think it's effective for more parochial goals or interests that they have at the immediate level, like branding themselves compared to other rivals in the society, or trying to demonstrate that they are more credible in the context of whatever their conflict environment is. So yeah, that's where we're going.
They haven't taken this course.
Exactly. They haven't read the article. Actually, there is a case. I was at Swarthmore last August with Lee Smithy. Have you heard from Lee Smithy at all? Did he give a lecture? He has a center that he has started that's based on looking at different frames of civil resistance. And he invited an activist who had been training people in northern India, and they were Muslim insurgents up there. And he said that they actually did read the article, and that some of them were actually convinced. So there you have it. Sometimes it works. So I actually think that the really interesting question is, who are the people who will be convinced by this and change their actions? And then who are the people who actually don't care what's effective or not and are doing it for other reasons, right? So there may actually be an important distinction to be made between the two groups. Okay, so let me get back to how would we study these sorts of conventional wisdoms? And let me get at what the specific types of goals would be. The first is that you can actually you can test these conventional wisdoms. They're empirical questions. You can lay them out as falsifiable hypotheses. That is, you can show using data, if you're crazy like me, that they're true or not. The second thing you can do is that you can actually compare the trends of nonviolent and violent campaigns. You can also look at the conditions under which these campaigns might succeed and fail. And you can also look at the strategic utility or even the long-term utility of different types of conflict. In particular, what I'm getting at here is not just what are the short-term policy consequences, that is, do they get what they want, but what are the long-term consequences for society by relying on one of these methods or the other? Are you going to end up with a democracy? Are you going to end up with a country that's in constant relapse and civil war? What are the long-term impacts of these types of conflict choices on how a society prospers or not? So let me talk about the NAVCO data project and how it departs from what we've already seen in the field. Now, there are a couple of key scholars. Actually, Doug Bond is sort of the man who had this territory for a number of years in the PANDA or PONSEX project. The PANDA project was, I can't remember the exact acronym, but the idea here was that it was what they call the Program on Nonviolent Sanctions. And he was collecting events data using a machine coding technique that's somewhat similar to what I'm doing now. And he was just trying to get at what the government was doing to the population and what the population was responding to the government with on a daily basis in every country in the world. So this was like a huge undertaking. And he wanted to take Gene Sharp's 198, now 203 plus methods of nonviolent action and categorize all of those activities according to those, so that we could get aggregate counts on what people were doing and why. And what Doug ultimately found, and why he sort of abandoned this idea, was that he found that there was no way for him to actually collect data on what people were doing on a daily basis with nonviolent action in particular. And the reason was because for some people, a nonviolent campaign is stay at home. It's not go out into the streets. It's unobserved. It's not reported. Or it's, have a toothbrush protest, and nobody knows what that means unless you're in that country and it's culturally relevant, So he found that he couldn't actually aggregate the data in a meaningful way. And so he now has just this highly lucrative private firm where he collects a bunch of data using his ideas framework, but isn't so much involved in looking at, nonviolent versus violent action. So there are a couple of other data sets out there. One is called the WHIV. It's out of Ohio State. A few sociologists collect annual counts of protest activity, but they don't really distinguish between violent and nonviolent. They look at what's happening in each country every year. This is from 1990, I think, to 2000. They have this data. And then there's the KEDS data, the Kansas Event Data System. This is at the University of Kansas. Ron Francisco is running the shop over there. And again, it's protest events mostly in Western Europe, but again, doesn't actually distinguish between nonviolent and violent events. They just kind of collect, it's domestic disturbances, on an annual basis. So with that kind of data, we really can't get at the questions we're interested in. And the other problem with it is that when you're looking at events data, that is, you're looking at an interaction on a daily basis, protesters do this, protesters do that on a day-to-day basis. What it looks like from a data perspective is that these are just independent actions every day, that they have nothing to do with each other. And in fact, when you try to use statistical inference to analyze them, you have to make that assumption for the statistical inferences, that they're all independent from each other. But we know they aren't. Actually, the important thing to know is that many of them are linked together in important ways, that they're representing a trajectory, a sequence of tactics that these groups are deliberately choosing one after the other to try to get what they want. And so for the NAVCO data, the first cut we took at it really tried to look at the campaign as an entire unit. So is this campaign, are these people relying on nonviolent strategies, or are they relying on violent strategies? And it sounds weird because it seems like you shouldn't really be able to separate one from the other because there's so many of these quote-unquote mixed campaigns. But I was actually shocked at how many campaigns fell into one or the other ideal types. That in fact there are campaigns that almost exclusively rely on nonviolent methods, and there are campaigns that rely almost exclusively, when they are prosecuting the conflict, on violent methods. And in fact, there are some of these mixed campaigns. Kurt Schock talked to you about some of them a couple weeks ago, I think, when he talked about the radical flank issue, and that's the later iteration of the data that he and I are working on. So basically, we have this multi-level strategy where we start with this aggregate data. And this aggregate data, what I mean by that is that it just says there was a campaign and we're describing it in different variables. So there was a campaign, it was associated with a security force defection, it succeeded, failed, this sort of thing. Instead of looking at the daily basis of the campaign, we're just looking at start, finish, there was one, it succeeded or failed. We have in the database from 1900 to 2006, 323 nonviolent and violent campaigns. And from there, the strategy that we're picking up on now is actually breaking that down even further. So we do have a new data set, the NAVCO 2.0. The undergraduate research assistants get a big kick out of the acronyms, and they've come up, they go play trivia in the bar, apparently. I've not gone with them, but they always name their team later iterations of NAVCO, like NAVCO 5.0, NAVCO 6.0, and they almost always win. So I know this because they put their winning sheets up all over the office. Anyway, so NAVCO 2.0 is an annual breakdown of these campaigns. So it's saying, from start to finish, let's say we're talking about the Philippines, 1983, 1984, 1985, 1986, what happened each year. So that's one better level, more granular level, because we can look at patterns over time within each campaign. And then our NAVCO 3.0 is actually aggregating weekly levels using this events data and aggregating it, and I'll show you how we're doing that in a little bit. So the typical variables that we're looking at when we're collecting these data are things that relate to the underlying theory of why civil resistance would work. So we look at peak membership, that is how many active participants did they have in a given campaign. We look at security force defections. In the later iterations, we're also looking at civilian bureaucrat defections. We're also looking at government repression. That is, did the government use violent repression to try to undermine the campaign's progress, or did they repress at the outset? We're also looking at whether there was material support from a foreign state supporting the campaign. We also actually look at whether there's a material support of the opposing state. And then we use a number of conventional control variables like regime type, regime capabilities, and the country population itself. So we find that nonviolent campaigns have actually had a striking level of success compared with the violent campaigns. So you see here that we have success, which means they achieved what they wanted, fully. Then we have limited success, which typically relates to, say, if they're a regime change campaign, they force a dictator to have elections, but maybe the dictator won. So that's partial success, and we actually don't include that in our findings for success. We put it as failure because we're trying to apply a strict measure. And then we have failed campaigns, which you'll see the vast majority of them are violent. These are ones that weren't actually capable of achieving any of their outcomes. Yeah.
How would you define a specific event in a nonviolent campaign that turned violent, but it was the protesters and not the state, or it would appear that it was the protesters and not the state that instituted or kind of carried out the violence? Yeah.
So it depends on whether it persisted or whether it was a one-shot deal. If it's a one-shot deal and the rest of it, we're talking 90% of it, was nonviolent, we would call that a nonviolent campaign. If it actually stopped being nonviolent at that point and started having these violent characteristics, it drops out of the data set as a failed nonviolent campaign, and it appears in the data set as a new violent one. In the NAVCO 2.0, we've tried to deal with this issue better by calling that a shift in strategy, so that we can get at the particular years at which they shifted a strategy without breaking down the campaigns into component parts at all. So that's what we're trying to do there. Yeah.
I have a basic question, but sorry for that. Why you started the easy comparison between the violence resistant and non-violence resistant? I think it's easy one because it's, of course, in different factors now changing the world, that's made the non-violence resistant maybe has more successful than others. Why you didn't choose to compare between, as example, you exampled Iran, why does it succeed in 1979 but failed in 2006? Mm-hmm. Even though the Saddam security service under the Shah Moro more stronger than the security service or the security guard. Why did all these studies started with this comparison between violence and non-violent? There is no studies about why succeed in Iran in 79 and failed now. Why succeed in Philippines, failed in Cuba or North Korea or other countries?
Yeah, so we do that in the book. The statistics are about comparing nonviolent and violent campaigns, and the case studies in the book are about comparing failed and successful nonviolent campaigns against one another. I mean, with Iran, if you wanted a quick answer, what I would say is that there are probably people in here who know a lot more about the case than I do. It's not my forte. But I would say, just based on my impression, that the campaign and the recent campaign was not very representative in terms of how many people, what types of people were involved. So if you look at the 77 to 79 revolution, you're talking about everybody. I mean, there was hardly anybody in terms of political groups, ideologies, genders that weren't involved. The recent one, it seems to me, was viewed, certainly by the regime, as an urban elite thing, like that intellectual, urban, left-wing elites, and students, and not very good urban-rural participation going on. And so if it's not viewed as representing broad bases or broad sectors of society, the security force defections are going to be much less likely to occur. So that's the quick answer to that one. But we do compare failed and successful nonviolent campaigns. in terms of your question of why we chose this comparison at the outset, is because nobody had done this before. There were all these people in the political violence scholarship who were arguing about different types of violence working, and they'd never compared it against other alternatives. As I said at the outset, if you've ever read anything in the Civil War literature, it's always Civil War onset or no activity going on at all. Everybody conflates conflict with violent conflict, and if violent conflict isn't occurring, they just treat it as no conflict is occurring. And I thought that this was a huge contribution to that, because we were saying that there are not only many alternatives to violence, realistic alternatives, but that actually they've been succeeding all the time. And the security studies canon has been completely blind to this huge strategic dimension. So that's why we did that comparison. Yeah.
Just in order to try to understand your classifications, is it okay if I ask about a couple of examples how you classify them?
Yep. If I remember, I'll tell you.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the first Palestinian intifada,
Yep.
mainly non-violent, but with throwing of rocks and Molotov cocktails.
Yep.
Violent, non-violent,
Yep.
success, failure, or partial success.
The first intifada is in the data set as a nonviolent conflict through 1990, and it's listed as a partial success. The rock throwing and stuff, we actually were able to get a report from the IDF that said that rock throwing and other violent sabotage and protest activities made up less than 8% of the Palestinian activities. 92% were purely, exclusively nonviolent. We put that in the nonviolent category. Now, we also have in the data set a concurrent violent campaign. So there's one that's operating at the same time. That's violent.
And two perhaps opposite examples. Kosovo, 10 years of non-violent, followed by violent uprising successful. Nepal, 10 years of violent Maoist insurgency, followed by a successful non-violent revolution.
Yeah.
How do you classify those?
Let's see, what did we do? With Nepal, I believe, I can't remember how we classified the violent one, but I know that we classified the nonviolent one as a partial success. The Kosovo, we classified the nonviolent campaign as a failure, and we classified the violent campaign, I think, as either a failure or a partial success. So that's what I think I remember. But you can pull the data off my website and take a look.
How did you distinguish between the violent and the nonviolent campaigns that were happening coincidentally in the Intifada?
So with the Intifada, what the decision was is that the sort of popular revolution that was going on seemed to be different from the exile PLO stuff. In fact, the PLO was sort of, definitely in the background during that, and they would admit that. I think they've admitted it in writings. So, it's like I say, a judgment call, but very controversial, certainly. Okay. So let me talk about the success rates by decade. One important coding point here is that if it's still ongoing in 2006, it's listed as a failure in the data set. So we don't give anything partial completion credit. If it hasn't succeeded by 2006, we just called it a failure as of 2006. But even with that strict coding rule, you'll see that the nonviolent campaigns have been increasingly effective over time. And I have not written anything explaining why yet. But there are a number of different potential explanations for this, one of which is learning. So the campaigns are actually learning from one another. And something that's interesting to think about is if campaigns are learning from one another, then regimes are probably also learning from one another. And so we're probably going to see a decline in the success rates, followed by another increase, and it'll be cyclical. So that's a hypothesis I will throw out that needs to be tested, which I plan to do. Yeah.
Can you say that again? So,
Yeah.
so that at some point, regimes or adversaries of nonviolent movements will also learn how to suppress those movements.
Yeah.
And so the success of nonviolent movements will go down, and there'll be then an increase in or throwback to violent.
Right. So what I meant to say is that nonviolent movements will learn how to get around those measures that regimes start to impose on them. Okay. So I think that there's almost like a decadal, cyclical process where one decade the nonviolent movements have it going on, the next decade the regime has it going on, the next decade the nonviolent movements are back, because all of this is based on a strategic interaction. And nonviolent movements may be particularly good at innovating because A, they have more people, and more people means more ideas, and you're much more likely to have innovation when you have people who are kind of on the margins bringing in good ideas. But the other reason is just because regimes will repress very predictably, and you circumvent that. You find out ways to circumvent that. So we expect to see cycles. Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, do you have a comparison? I'm sure you do, but a comparison of like success and failure rates by just like nonviolent and just violent movements by decade? So like to compare like the decades that the success was in kind of just what you were describing before of the cyclical, but being able to see kind of how that.
Yeah. So these are actually rates. So if you take away the red bars and just look at the blue bars, those are rates of nonviolent campaign success by decade. And if you take away the blue bars, that's rates of violent success by decade. And you can see that both are cyclical. Yes?
Yeah, this is indeed a fascinating table, actually, and the difference between before 60s and after 60s, as you rightly point out, one could be associated with decolonization and the experience with nonviolent movements actually in Africa and Asia and elsewhere during the period before 60s. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if the other explanation is also due to international support for human rights, democratization, and active support for certain regime change actually,
Yep.
After the 1960s. So there could be not just the learning experience, but there could be additional factors particularly focused on international support for human rights and democratization.
Yeah, I think that's...
And the mushrooming of civil societies during the period following the 1960s.
Right. I think those are all very plausible and testable. One thing about the support for human rights and democratization, there are a couple of reasons why there might be reasons to challenge that. The first is that most of these campaigns aren't happening in democracies, right? They're happening in really difficult regimes. And they're not even happening in regimes that are headed toward the democracy way until they actually face these domestic challengers. And that we have this other really interesting finding, which is that direct support for them actually makes them more likely to fail, the nonviolent movements, which is really interesting too. And I have some hunches about why that's the case. So we're now classifying that, but it's always by states. So when states support them, they're more likely to fail.
External states.
Yes. And I think there are a couple reasons. One is that there's a notion that it undermines, it might actually turn off some of the potential members of the movement who are opposed to external state intervention. But another thing that's another kind of political sciencey thing is that it creates this free rider problem, where if there's an expectation that, well, they're just going to get boatloads of money from the United States, so I don't have to show up at the next event, then it creates this sort of self-reinforcing laziness in terms of movement participation, which is the key factor that produces these points of leverage. Yeah.
There's a striking decrease in violent success after the end of the Cold War. Is that correlated with a decreased external support for violent insurgencies?
Yeah, I think it is. Because external support's the single most important factor for violent insurgent success. They don't face the same constraints with participation that nonviolent movements do. So they could care less whether, a lot of the public thinks they're legitimate or not, as long as they're getting what they want to fight.
So that trend may not be cyclical.
Well, so a colleague of mine actually thinks it is, and his name is Jay Lyle. He's written a great article with Isaiah Wilson called Rage Against the Machines. What he finds is he codes things a little bit differently from the way I do, but he finds that states are becoming really inferior at counterinsurgency. And the reason is because they have these unbelievably highly mechanized militaries that are just horribly suited to fight ground-level insurgencies. That is, you've got people riding around in Humvees with full-on body armor and not getting out, talking to the population, getting information. You have drones and fighter jets bombing people, but actually to win an insurgency war, you have to talk to people, and you have to sustain high casualties while you're doing that. So he's arguing that the over-mechanization of militaries is actually will increase the success rates of these insurgents, and that's I think the trend bears out not because there's more success for insurgencies, but there are more stalemates, and states don't stay in stalemates forever. They get out. So if you reverse these statistics and looked at stalemates for violent campaigns, the numbers would go up a little bit for violent campaigns. But because our interest was not in stalemating a state, it was in succeeding against the state, the numbers are a little lower. Yeah.
So what is the name of your colleague who wrote that?
Jason Lyle, Lyall, and the paper is on his website at Yale, so you can just Google him and it'll come right up. And the paper is extremely interesting. All right, so where was I? Okay, where do I want to go? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the overall argument that we're making in the book. The bottom line that we find here that we don't report in the article, but that's very much related to what we find in the article, is that nonviolent campaigns just have a far superior mobilization capacity. And what that means is that they're better at getting more participants, and they're much better at getting more diverse set of participants, is they can appeal to a much wider group of people. And wide groups of people will increase the probability that you can get these members of the security forces or the civilian bureaucrats to not even really turn, but just stop cooperating with the regime. Local, domestic pressure on a regime is a much more reliable source of power than external support. Because external state sponsors are extremely fickle. They're really, really fickle. They burn out. They stop wanting to support groups over time. They're subjected to multiple different constraints of their own, not just resource constraints, but political constraints. And if you're relying on an external sponsor for the success of your movement, you're making yourself really vulnerable to the whims of that sponsor. So the bottom line, if there's one key takeaway, it's that nonviolent movements are better at avoiding that problem of having to rely on a foreign state sponsor. They're better at succeeding by broadening their base of support. So let's talk about some reasons why that would be the case. I'm going to identify 4 reasons why, and they're based on the fact that nonviolent campaigns have lower physical barriers to participation. They have lower informational barriers to participation, lower moral barriers, and fewer commitment problems. So let me first talk about the lower physical barriers. So basically, nonviolent campaigns, there are a lot of, as you know, there are just tons of different potential methods that you could rely on if you're a nonviolent activist. They're going to be very locally contingent based on whatever the cultural symbolism is or whatever the points of leverage are with regard to an opponent. But typically, you can have a nonviolent campaign that relies on things like methods of dispersion, which means that you actually stay away from the regime. So you stay at home, or you bang on pots and pans, or you do other forms of dispersive nonviolent action that actually require zero physical effort. And that's very different from prosecuting a violent campaign, which typically requires a lot of physical effort. In fact, it may also require physical deprivations, as people have to actually go underground. They can't actually live their day jobs while they're participating. They're going to be constantly depriving themselves of typical benefits that they wouldn't have to if they were in a nonviolent campaign. And that's not to say that nonviolent campaigns don't entail risks. Obviously, they often entail deadly risks for people, but the more people you get, the fewer those are going to be. The second thing is that there are lower informational barriers. This goes back to the point of critical mass theorists, who basically say that the more people you get, the lower the perception of risk will be. There are powers in numbers. So let's say somebody came up to you and knocked on your door and said, there's going to be a big rally tonight out in the square. And it's an injustice that you really care about. And you actually really do care about it, and you really like to participate. But they also say, our opponent doesn't want us to be there, and so it's going to be risky. So if you're going to come, participate at your own risk. Well, here's the big benefit for a nonviolent movement. If you wanted to participate but you were concerned about the risk, all you have to do is look out your window at 8 o'clock and see how many people are gathering there in the square. And if it looks like it's thousands and thousands of people, you're going to feel much less vulnerable to regime repression. There's power in numbers. Violent campaigns suffer from a really difficult problem in this regard, which is that almost all of the planning and the actual prosecution of their conflict occurs underground. So they can't resolve this information critical mass problem. They can't assure you that there will be power in numbers. They can't show you that or demonstrate that by their very presence. Nonviolent campaigns can. Another thing is that even though we're not arguing that nonviolent campaigns succeed because they have the moral high ground, there is a moral dimension to people's calculations when they think about participation in a campaign. And it's much easier for people to commit to a campaign when they are assured that they're not going to have to hurt or kill anybody, as opposed to actually hurting and killing people is a condition for your participation. There's a big difference. And most people in the world can't make that leap, it seems. So there are fewer moral barriers to participation here. The final thing is that there are fewer commitment problems. As I've said, there is a much more diverse set of methods of nonviolent action than there are of violent action. And so people tend to be willing to do things that are very low risk, so stay in your house tonight, don't go to work. Okay, fine by me, I'll just take a day off, These sorts of things are not quite as risky. They can be risky in some contexts, but not in general, right? Whereas if somebody comes up and says, take this rock and hurl it at that person and try to kill them or hurt them badly or disable them with it, that's risky. I mean, even if I throw it, I'm going to feel paranoid for the rest of the week, So it's easier to get people to commit to doing some kind of nonviolent actions, even though in many of these contexts the barrier to any type of participation is high. The key point we're making is that the barriers are lower in these contexts for nonviolent resistance than they are for violent resistance. It's an empirical question. So what do we find? Well, we actually find that nonviolent campaigns are about twice as big on average, or maybe more, than violent campaigns in terms of the number of people participating in the campaigns. Yeah?
Going back to the earlier slide, to my way of thinking, it does not answer the question, what motivates to millions of people to appear in a square in the morning? Mm-hmm. That is brilliantly captured, that question, in the book that you cite here by Arthur Gordon Ashe and Adam Roberts, actually, the Oxford book.
Yeah.
And he says, actually, he was in Czechoslovakia, he was elsewhere, but he could not explain from all the data that was presented in the book, mm-hmm. what motivates people to appear in a square for a demonstration in millions actually, what are they thinking and what motivates them?
Yeah.
And I don't think these answer that question very well.
No, they don't.
Now, the other side of the issue, if you look at the literature on civil conflict, hardship is identified as a key factor that motivates people to take action, particularly decentralized mobilization. And I wonder if the data that you presented showed anything on hardship. Could it be hardship that explains part of this participation that we have just seen? You're absolutely right. These are important factors, but they themselves do not, in my judgment, explain the motivational factor that drives people.
No, I agree with you. I don't think that, it's important to note that we're not trying to explain mobilization.
Okay.
We're trying to explain why people would mobilize nonviolently as opposed to violently, right? Yeah. Right. So, but in terms of so you're right. There are generally three big reasons why people mobilize. What you call hardship, a lot of people would call economic deprivation or relative deprivation, or a big grievance against the regime. So regime repression, right? And then the other one is political deprivation. So usually authoritarian regimes. So in terms of the types of places where we're most likely to see these campaigns.
There's a fourth factor, if you want,
okay.
that is media exposure.
Okay.
In a way.
Yeah. Okay. So if you think about these three big things, that if you're looking at the perfect candidate state for a major civil conflict to erupt, you're talking about poor states or states with really high levels of economic inequality, authoritarian regimes, and ones that routinely repress their people. Okay, so these are the ones that we should expect to be most susceptible to these movements. And incidentally, there are also the cases where it should be hard for nonviolent movements to succeed because the regimes are very repressive, and so even if the people want to rise up, it's very difficult to succeed. So in the book, we do actually account for this, and we try to explain not so much where they emerge, but whether the conditions under which they emerge also predict whether they succeed or fail. And I actually found no support for it. I actually ran the numbers in every possible way I could find, and I did not find support for it. So the controversy continues. Yeah.
I'm interested in hearing more about the methods that you use to gather the data, particularly the use of the newspaper articles.
Yeah. So at this stage, we relied more on qualitative studies done by other authors than we did news articles. I used news articles to gather the membership data, but in general, I'm going to give you a source that I found really useful. It is it's an encyclopedia of civil resistance, an online bibliography that you can access for free, and it's at www.civilresistance.info. And it's compiled by Howard Clark, April Carter, somebody else. And they compiled it, and it was actually very useful because they gave like a bibliography of everything that they'd ever read that covered any dimension of civil resistance. So that was actually one of the first places I started when I collected this data. And then from there, I looked at a lot of the other kind of canon literature on civil resistance, including Peter Ackerman and Jack Duvall's work, Kurt Schock, Stephen Zunis has just written volumes and volumes on this stuff. And then I looked at some of the Freedom House data on civic campaigns, and then from there looked at tons of encyclopedia entries on these conflicts. So the concern is that there are unreported, civil resistance campaigns that nobody thought were important enough to include in any of the encyclopedias. And you can see how that could be the case, particularly for the ones that never got off the ground because they failed early. So there's a really important inclusion criteria here for the campaigns that we're comparing, which is that they're all what I would classify as major campaigns. They all sustained a membership of at least 1,000 over the course of their duration, and we're all seeking maximal goals. So regime change, anti-occupation, or secession. And for the ones that are below that threshold, we're going to miss them, but that includes both violent and nonviolent campaigns. So because we're comparing them against each other, the bias isn't debilitating for our findings. But it's still troubling from an empirical standpoint. That's where the newspaper articles come in. So what we're trying to do with NAVCO 3.0 is we're actually trying to machine code open source news reports from Reuters to try to capture whether there's activity that's under the radar that never picks up and becomes a major campaign. And that can help us determine when some of these campaigns fail before they even start, in a way. All right, so I mentioned that we did find that nonviolent campaigns were associated with a much higher membership level on the average than violent campaigns. And we also found a very robust association between membership level and success. So you'll see here that when you have on the low end of participation, you have up to 10% success, pretty low coercion rate, even in the conflict literature. And in the upper end, you're talking about upwards of 80+% odds of success in the higher range. And these are fitted values, so they're predicted values based on averaging out all of the data. But the bottom line here is that we tend to see a very robust association between the number of people who are active participants in the conflict and the success of the resistance movement. Yeah.
Is that absolute participation or relative to the population?
Relative to population. Yeah. So at the same time, it's also really clear that membership in and of itself is not necessarily the most important thing. It's probably the most important thing, but it's not sufficient in explaining success. We've seen a lot of campaigns that have really broad-based or even high numbers of participants that fail. And then you see ones that have low numbers of members that seem to succeed for some reason or another. So what we argue is that the reason is because the quality of the participation matters as much as the quantity. And I alluded to it earlier when I said that broad-based participation is much more important in terms of affecting the change and applying those points of pressure to the regime than the numbers, the sheer numbers. Because if the security forces, for instance, can't relate to any of the people in the streets, they don't really care about what they're saying. But if the security forces see their kids in the streets, they care. And they are much less likely to try to repress them. In fact, one of my colleagues, Terrence Lee, teaches at Singapore National. He actually wrote an article about when regimes crack down on protesters in comparative political studies. And he even found that one way that regimes are trying to circumvent this problem of the troops or the security forces relating to the population is that they have like mandatory stay-at-home days for security forces who sympathize with the population. So in Burma, for instance, he said he found that the security forces would be notified in advance, you're going to be ordered to shoot. If you're uncomfortable with that, stay home. So that they knew that the only people they got were the people who were willing. So as I said, regimes figure out ways to circumvent this, but in the majority, you don't see that level of cooperation over the long term by security forces toward populations they relate to. And interestingly, if you look at this, what it's showing is a comparison of how the number of participants from low to high affects the probability for security force defections with violent campaigns and with nonviolent campaigns. And what you can see actually is that the effect of membership falls out for violent campaigns in terms of how membership affects the probability of security force defections. There's really no significant relationship there, but there is like a really high, almost linear relationship between membership and security force defections for nonviolent campaigns. What this means is that If you have a ton of members and you're a violent campaign, you're still not going to be able to get those security force defections, because the more people who are shooting at them, the more likely they are to shoot back. You know, they're just not going to. They're going to feel like they're fighting a war to the end, instead of feeling like they should give in because there's so many people in the streets. All the people have guns, you know, so they're not going to readily turn themselves over. Whereas with the nonviolent campaigns, the more popular it looks, the probability of security force defections goes way up. So that's a really important distinction. So, you know, we can think about the effects of repression, because that comes up a lot. Yeah.
Going back to the previous two tables, actually, fascinating tables, actually. In your book, do you look at the youth data participation rate? I was not clear how you got the participation rates, actually, in order to put this chart together. And my question is that, is it broken down by youth? Because youth has been a very, very significant factor in many of these campaigns.
Yeah, we actually don't break it down by youth in these data, but we do in the next data set. So we actually break it down by a number of different characteristics. Youth, gender, age, well, age is youth, right? Age, religion, ideology, political party, rural, urban. So we try to look at all of those divisions, because qualitatively, when we're looking at the case studies, it seemed like that stuff mattered. I mean, I mentioned the Iran case. I think the rural-urban thing is very real there. I think that if the rural-urban divide could be overcome by that campaign, it could have a much higher chance of succeeding. So we're trying to get at that in the next data. We'll have more. Well, I have no idea. So we should have this data finished by the end of this summer, and then we're going to start, you know, writing up the papers the summer or fall. So we looked at the effects of repression as well, because, as I said, there's this conventional wisdom that if the state is repressing the nonviolent movement, it should be much less likely to succeed. But how many of you are familiar with the notion of backfire? Have you read about backfire? This is the idea that, you know, a regime's repression boomerangs on it and actually, you know, is counterproductive to the regime's goals. What we find is that violent campaigns are much more likely to experience that backfire effect. Or, I'm sorry, nonviolent campaigns are more likely to experience the backfire effect. Violent campaigns, there's really no effective repression. It doesn't increase or decrease their chances of success. It just kind of stays the same. We expect that regimes will try to violently repress violent movements. But when they repress nonviolent movements, the nonviolent movements are often able to produce that backfire effect, where they're able to actually succeed despite repression. Let me talk about the interesting state support finding. First of all, states, this is overt state support, material support. States are much less likely to support nonviolent campaigns than violent ones. They like supporting violent campaigns. They look like they're going to win. They look like they're going to do something and make some headway. So they don't put their chips on nonviolent movements in general. However, even when they do, we find that it doesn't really matter. Actually, it makes no difference for nonviolent campaigns whether they get state support or not. It may actually undermine their probabilities for success for reasons I mentioned before. But it really is the moneymaker for violent campaigns. If they get state support, it really boosts their chances of success by something like 30%. So violent insurgencies seek and are more likely to obtain state support. But the problem is that, as I said, state support is extremely fickle. And they lose it as often as they get it. And you know, you can look to lots of examples. The PLO and being expelled from Jordan, you know, it's a primary sanctuary at the time in 1970. There are all kinds of examples of violent insurgencies being either reined in. You know, the states actually put conditions on their aid. When they feel like the insurgency has worn out its welcome, they might actually try to kill the people. You know, so there are all kinds of negative, perverse consequences of accepting state support, especially over the long run. And what we find is that nonviolent campaigns don't get it and are probably better off without it. So there you have that. One really interesting question is, what are the long-term consequences of insurgency? And the reason this comes up is because people are always throwing out all these examples of successful violent revolutions. They're always saying, what about Algeria? What about China? What about Russia? Cuba? What about all these examples of these successful nonviolent movements? Aren't these in the exact opposite of what your empirical and theoretical expectations are? And I say, sure, they actually are really good outliers and counterexamples of the argument, but let's take a closer look at these cases, and let's look at the long-term consequences for whether an insurgency relies on nonviolent or violent methods. So in all of the cases I just mentioned, the subsequent regimes that were victorious insurgents imposed, in many cases, very brutal orders over their people, and often were succumbing to civil war recurrence. And so what I thought was, let's actually test that. Let's see what the long-term outcomes are for these countries that have faced nonviolent movements and violent movements. And interestingly, what we found is that if you just look in the 5 years after the conflict itself, there's already a noticeable and statistically significant effect. That nonviolent campaigns, if you're looking at an average country, so this isn't one that's a democracy or non-democracy, just average. If you look 5 years after the conflict has ended, 41% of the countries that faced a nonviolent campaign were democracies 5 years after the conflict ended. Only 4% of the ones that faced violent insurgencies were. That's crazy. That's a crazy difference statistically. I'm very lucky to have found a relationship that's that substantively important. Now, it becomes even more important if you consider countries that were just democracies when they faced these campaigns, where for violent campaigns, 15% of them remained democracies after the conflict ended, and 84% of them remained democracies after the nonviolent conflict ended. Yeah.
How would you classify, or I guess the kind of end result of a place like Northern Ireland that had, a very violent campaign on both sides, but also like kind of tastes of nonviolent resistance in other areas, and then agreement that then didn't, I guess.
Right. So we would call Northern Ireland a violent campaign. It's in the data set as a violent campaign, and it's in a democracy. So that would be counted as a democracy. In terms of, are you asking about the success or failure aspect? I think we coded it as, I'm trying to remember.
Unsuccessful under violent measures and successful in adopted peaceful.
Is that what? Are you reading it off the data set?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think that was right. I think what we called it is a partial success because they achieved some level of regional autonomy and devolution. Yeah. So we call that a partial success from a violent campaign.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you measure the successful and unsuccessful depends on the goals of the
campaign. Yep. And actually, that's a difference that we make because most studies like this look at it from the perspective of the state.
But many movements, they change their goals in different ways, in different years.
It's true. So with the NAVCO 2.0, we have a variable in there that's changed its goals. So whether they changed their goals from, say they wanted secession, and they changed their goal to just regional autonomy, because they realized secession was too difficult. So we're trying to account for that in the new data. We don't have it in the stuff I'm presenting right now. Okay, so that's just democracy. That's looking at the regime type after the campaign. If you look at civil war recurrence, this is looking at within the 10 years after the campaign has ended, what's the probability that the country will relapse into civil war or just experience a civil war within 10 years. Violent campaigns are 43% likely on average, and that's controlling for all the other typical determinants of civil war. And nonviolent campaigns are 15% less likely. So it's a smaller effect, but it's still statistically and substantively important. Nonviolent campaigns are associated with higher levels of civil peace, and higher levels of democracy after the campaign is ended, and that's whether they succeeded or failed. So just the presence of a nonviolent campaign has these effects. When we actually control for whether it succeeds or fails, all of these effects increase. So the notion here is that the actual campaigns, the nature of the campaigns tend to reproduce themselves in the institutions that emerge after the conflict is over. And that's interesting. It's actually very consistent with a study that Freedom House did called How Freedom is Won in 2005, where they also found that transitions to democracy, or any type of transition, was much more likely to result in democracy if the transition had some sort of nonviolent civic change, civic pressure during the course of the transition. Yeah.
But the same thing occurred whether it was a violent or a nonviolent campaign, because it tended to reproduce itself. The violent produced more violence subsequently.
Right.
And
Exactly. And so my explanation for this is that violent campaigns tend to have more martial values in them in general, whereas nonviolent campaigns just tend to be more consensus-based because they have to be to get people to participate, and those institutions reproduce themselves. You might also be familiar with the language on parallel institutions, because a lot of what nonviolent campaigns do is establish parallel administrative structures like underground media. They might have a judicial system. They have often political leadership within the campaign that may or may not be members of the opposition political party. And so they already have and done some institution building on their own that then allows for easy replication after the conflict is ended if they're successful. So the bottom line is that it appears that nonviolent campaigns are good for society if you consider these things good for society, which we can argue about. But anyway, for a lot of policymakers, they would be concerned with these two outcomes in particular. So let me talk about what I see as the major limitations for this study, although there are others. The first is that the data deal with ideal types, as I've said, nonviolent, violent. They also deal with ideal types of goals, which you just brought up, regime change, secession, anti-occupation. What we really want to do is get at this more granular level where we can look at changes within the campaign over time. And we're also really interested in the sequence of those changes to see if that matters in the ultimate outcome. Another thing that's difficult is that we have a very over-aggregated unit of analysis. This is chunky data. Some of these campaigns are 25 years long, others are 2 years long. It poses all sorts of problems for statistics and everything. And so we don't really get at the discrete tactical choices that these campaigns are making, which is actually what the activists themselves care about, right? They care about what should we be doing to succeed. And I've been really glad that when people have asked me for coffee to ask me how they overthrow their government, I get to tell them I don't know because I have very aggregate data. And that's my out right now. And soon I won't be able to say that. But anyway. So the other thing is that we can't really get at the fact that these conflicts are very interactive over time. So it's not just that, a campaign decides to be nonviolent and then it succeeds. There are daily, hourly decisions that are being made in response to state actions and vice versa. And so we really want to get at that in a better way. And the other thing is that the statistics, because they're so clunky, really just get at the correlation and not the causation. And we really need to do that if we're, going to make a compelling inferential case in the long run. Although I think what we've done already is a good contribution. So the extensions are that we're collecting panel data, which is annual data from 1900 to 2006. We're about 70% finished on that data. We're also collecting daily data from 1989 to 2004 using automated text analysis software, which I'll explain in a not boring way in just a second. And then the other thing is we're also including a number of other variables, that especially intra-organizational ones. So these things like who's participating, age, gender, race, etc. We're also looking at how many competing factions are there within the campaign. We're looking at how many named organizations exist and when they join the campaign. We're also looking at more variation in which states are actually supporting it. We're also looking at NGO support. We're looking at parallel institution building like media, adjudication, political, economic structures, social welfare services, and this sort of thing. So we're getting at a lot of what we think are going to be important factors that we haven't been able to look at just because the data has been so highly aggregated. So let me tell you how we do this text analysis stuff. What we do is we use open source lead sentences. So we're not going to capture everything, but we're going to capture really good trends. And what we do is you take a lead sentence like this from the New York Times, you run it through a coding machine, you tell the coding machine what to look for, and you end up with data that looks like this, which is a date, an actor, a target, an action code. There are about 300 different potential acts that are basically verbs that you tell the machine to look for. We have a list of 10,000 verbs, and it'll assign a code to it that's between 1 and 200 or something like that. And in this case, the lead sentences was something like, France respected a resolution for sanctions against Libya. So that means that France is targeting Libya with a threat to boycott, embargo, or sanction. This is what the machine pulls out. Then we upload this into an online interface, and we have our research assistants go through and look at the entire story and add all the detail we want. So it's a little bit of a labor-intensive process, but what we end up with is really cool stuff like this, where we can actually look at the aggregated actions over time for the different campaigns. This is not from the Nonviolent Act data. This is not from NAVCO 3.0. This is actually from the Global Terrorism Database, whose model for this I'm sort of applying to our study. So, ultimately what we get to do then is look at, what are these groups choosing over time? We also get to look at the state's behavior toward the group and how that's interacting, and we can get at some of the sequencing. And we'll ultimately be using things like agent-based models, which are computer simulations. You assign certain parameters, let the model run, and that helps you to test your hypotheses against the data and see how these groups are really acting. Yeah?
It was sort of questions sort of in that realm,
Yeah.
without building a model. But even in mediation, we did some manual coding where we would pick the actors, look at the interaction, characterize the interaction, match it against a verb set, and we built a little database that did some of the stuff that your multivariable model is going to do ultimately. But you're there already.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Can we talk about that afterward?
Yeah.
All right, great. Yeah.
Who do you see as the audiences for your research, and what do you want your research to do, and how is it going to do that?
So there are a number of different audiences from my perspective. The first is the academic community, because I want to get tenure at my institution. So I'm going to publish in scholarly journals. But I also think that this is a really good thing to produce a cumulative body of work on this topic that people are already starting to pay attention to, and actually other people are starting to take on civil resistance. We were just talking about the Civil War Research Center at Prio in Norway. I was there 2 weeks ago. They asked me to come to talk to them about how they can build civil resistance into their research program. So that was very exciting. And academics, I think this is like a really fertile ground for us. The second major audience is, to me, policymakers in the government, but not exclusively in the government. I shouldn't say policymakers, I should say practitioners, because government is one set of practitioners I'm interested in targeting with this research, but also obviously activists who are interested in efficacy issues and long-term consequences. I really want this to become a popularized idea, so I really want to publish trade things on this, and also hopefully lots of op-eds and shorter pieces. But I have to get tenure before I do that. But that's going to come soon, so hopefully. So anyway, that's definitely part of this as well. But all of that it takes a lot of time, so I'm still in the works on that. How are we going to do it? As I said, publishing a combination of scholarly and trade works. Some of the undergraduate research assistants that we've had working on the project wrote some interim research briefs that they then presented at a symposium this fall to other academics who gave them feedback. And ultimately, in the next phase of the internship, I want them to actually be policy briefs that are written to like State Department officials and that sort of thing. So that's what we're aiming for in the immediate. Yeah.
Have you and your crew ever thought about plugging some of this data into Hans Rosling's shop at Gapminder?
No.
Would it work that way, or would it translate well into what they produce?
I don't know. I'm actually not super familiar with that. So maybe we can talk afterward, and you can tell me what that is.
Sure.
Actually, one thing I forgot to mention that we are doing, which is very cool, is we're going to add GIS codes to this so that we can look at where they move around and where the regime moves around in its repression. It's going to be very cool looking. What's that? Right, yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
With the news articles that you're pulling,
Yeah.
Do you guys do anything with like any kind of new media, like bloggers and stuff like that as well?
Yeah, I mean that's like the huge untapped area that we would love to get into, and there are people who are developing this web crawling software and everything that are collecting all of that and writing code to analyze it, and it's just beyond my capability. So we're not really doing that right now, but there is a project actually that's ongoing, the Digital Media Archive. You know about it?
Yeah, I met with actually one of their the kind of the founders of that project for the basically mapping blogospheres.
Yeah.
It's really, really cool.
It's very cool. I think that we'll delegate that to them. They can do that, and we'll do what we're doing. But we actually are talking to each other quite a bit and trying to, maintain some compatibility between our research designs. So yeah, that's something that I'm very interested in.
Who's going to fund the activity?
Well, we have some funding from ICNC right now, and we have some from Wesleyan as well, and then we're putting in grants to NSF and USIP.
I mean, the richest web crawler on earth is Google, and
Right.
you just need to find a way either to pay them for the specific searches or add the terms to their activity if they're not doing it already, or look at congruency or proximity for different phrases you're interested in, but they'll do it for you too. Especially if you can find a way to demonstrate to them how it's going to contribute to their revenue.
Right.
So it's
Interesting.
a trade strategy.
I wonder how much that would cost.
I don't know, but if you can generate the revenue, it'll cost you nothing.
Right. It's interesting because we actually talked to some federal agencies about this, and we toyed for a little bit with the idea of hiring some programmers to come up with a new kind of web crawling thing. And they said we have people who are coming to us with saying you can have this for $4 million, and then we realized that we were way out of our league on that. So we have
a primitive one that's highly targeted.
Yeah.
And it won't search maybe as deeply or as widely, but if you target it at certain domains or at blogs,
Right.
you can get a high yield from a low cost, and it will be targeted. So
Right.
they're building engines that'll do everything.
Yeah, that's true.
And with some the more discrimination you have, the more expensive it is. But if you want to do it superficially at a targeted level, you'll get more detail than you have now.
We will, yeah, I agree with you. I think we'll get more detail. We'll probably also get a ton of noise, right? So one of the things that I like about the system that we're using here is that it actually does cut down on a considerable amount of noise that you wouldn't necessarily cut down on the web crawling. So I think what we would get from the go ahead.
You reduce noise with your search strategies, not with your data collection. So that's still under your control, no matter where you get your data, I think.
I think to an extent. I mean, because what we're doing is collecting events data, it's more than just content. It's we're looking at events, like specific discrete events. So that's why I've had the resistance to that
And events have characteristics that are specific, but they also have lots of non-specific ones that if you can develop some unobtrusive markers for those, and then collect that data and see if there's any correlations there, you might be able to tease something out.
Yeah.
Yeah, but with this question that regarding the data, all your data will be in English.
Yeah.
That's many of the countries or the revolution there have depends on how they seen